Okay. Can a central office of a large school system move my son to another school entirely due to his IEP, even when there are classrooms that suit his needs at the school where he is, but there isn't space or availability at the present time? No. See, a lack of space or availability would be, and I haven't looked at your IEP, okay, to sit there and understand all the nuances, because your question, though well written, is also extremely ambiguous in a lot of areas. So, I'm answering it on a very, very broad kind of way, with the caveat in there that I haven't seen your child's IEP and don't understand what their thinking is, or the team's thinking with regards to the need for a more restricted setting. So because or a specialized program, I mean, there's a lot of nooks and crannies in there that they can use to sit there and make the determination. So just off your base question, this is how I'm going to answer. Now, if they're claiming that if they're not disagreeing with you that classrooms exist within his current school that suit his needs, but the only reason they can't place him there is because they don't have space or availability at the present time, that is that's not a good excuse. They're wanting they're wanting to move him into a more restricted setting based upon what I would consider an arbitrary factor, or one of administrative convenience. And in this particular situation, this form of administrative convenience is not one that trumps the protections of his IEP and the mandate of least restrictive environment. And so the mandate of least restrictive environment becomes very important here with regards to the analysis, because in this case, unless you voluntarily are sitting there going, yeah, we'll go over here, but I would never accept some kind of temporary. This isn't some hotel, all right? This is a public school. It's a government entity, and if you sit there and if they go, oh, if you only go over here temporarily when they have a spot, well, there'll never be a spot. All right, and that's why in situations like this, you got to sort of stand your ground, because you don't ever want to go off of a wing and a prayer or a promise when it comes to special education. I've been involved in too many prayers and promises and good intentions that never pan out, and that quite frankly are key reasons parents end up having to call me in the first place, is because they were sold a bad bill of goods or false promises. It destroys trust. It's just not worth it for schools to do that. All right. So with that being said, let me go ahead and answer that. Can he be put on a waiting list and stay in general education until a spot becomes? You can negotiate that with the school. But like I said, I don't understand, or I don't understand because I haven't seen what's going on as to why they're recommending a more restrictive setting. But you could negotiate that. There can be a myriad of alterations and changes made to your child's school day, including moving to a half day. I mean, trying other aspects of partial general education with some pull-out and resource, providing your son an aid, those kind of things. All of these things become negotiable with regards to the IEP team, but as far as put on a waiting list, I don't know what that. Okay, I'm expecting a call from the district this week, and I don't know what I can ask for. Well, this will be the second move since school started in September. Wow. Well, I'd like to know why they did the first move. He's been doing better in school, but the recommendation is more restrictive environment in his IEP. Now, let me go ahead and tell you, the IEP is what dictates least restrictive environment. So it's how they design, and they, including you, because you're a member of the IEP team. And this is why parents need to keep their eyes open. The entire environment, which is determined at the very end of the IEP meeting. Okay, least restrictive environment is not determined until the very end of the IEP meeting. If the school people are designing the IEP for a specific location, that's predetermination. That is a huge no-no. They cannot do that. That is a huge violation. It's not even a procedural violation. It's a substance violation, which is the worst kind of violation in special education. You don't predetermine. You design the IEP, and after you design the IEP, including accommodations, supplemental aids and services, goals, services themselves as far as specialized instruction, related services, all of those things, then provide a good snapshot of where this IEP can be implemented. And that's where the determination of least restrictive environment comes in. Where can this IEP be implemented? And so when you sit there and say, well, that his IEP is more restrictive, well, that didn't happen on its own. The IEP just didn't write itself. So the IEP team, including yourself, somehow made the IEP more restrictive to where it can only be implemented in certain locations. And so this is where you would need to go back, look at your IEP and see what changes were made. And if they increased special education minutes to the point where it's outside the threshold of what can be reasonably done or accomplished inside the general education setting, then of course that IEP can only be implemented in a certain environment. This is why, I always encourage parents to become knowledgeable on how this process works. I mean, so this is what I'm doing. I'm explaining all of this to you. And it really does help to sort of have them map this out. I had a case a couple years ago to where they wanted, we were fighting over a least restrictive environment. And my child, Down syndrome, and she had no behaviors, and there was no reason why she couldn't be in general education to the maximum extent appropriate, which is what the legal standard is. To the maximum extent appropriate. So what did the school system do to try to justify a more restrictive setting? Well, they cleverly put into the IEP that she needed social emotional learning. And so they felt like she needed to be pulled out in order to work in the special education room on social emotional development and peer interaction. And what I said was that for her is better suited in a push-in type of setting, to have the speech language pathologist or the resource teacher work with her around her peers in an actual situation to where you can show her and watch her and observe her and model for her or with her. That it wasn't anything that required a pullout of that environment. And so because I caught that, and we removed those minutes as something that needed to be done outside the setting, well, gosh, what do you know? The percentages of general education exposure then bumped her back into that 0-1 or a high 0-3 category, which is the percentages they use under child find numbers. Anyway. So, this is where you just got to sit there and be very mindful of how they design the IEP and call into question whether those services have to be done outside of the general ed setting or if it's something that can be pushed into the general education setting. All right. And I did a little crude diagram, and follow me on this. This line is the continuum of alternative placements. All right. This is the LRE continuum. That's what this line represents. All right. And as you can see, little Johnny up here, look how happy he is. Right here, this is general education. This is a kid, this is the optimal viewpoint. This is what the goal is for all students that have an IEP, is to not have an IEP. And that's what this end bar represents, is a student that doesn't require an IEP. That is always our goal. We're working toward this goal. And so if your child has an IEP, then they're automatically starting right here, one notch outside of that optimal. And that's their least restrictive environment because they have an IEP. Now, if your child requires, let's say, some accommodations, some supplemental aids and services, then at that time, boom, here you go. You're one more point down, more restrictive because your child requires accommodations and some supplemental aids and services and maybe some, let's say, consultative services in occupational therapy. All right. So, but let's say your child requires an aid. Well, you'd move a little bit further down, still in general education, because that aid can be provided inside of this setting, the optimal setting of general education. But let's say that your child has reading or math difficulties and they need reinforcement in instruction or differentiated instruction, and that requires them to be instructed here, but then pulled out into resource room for some reinforcement. Well, then all of a sudden now you're jumping into this category. Now, here you can even have the resource teacher coming in here providing support in here. But when you start pulling the child out, they move over into a more restrictive setting. Now, the majority of their day is still in general education, but they're getting pull-out time, meaning that they are leaving the general education to go into a more restrictive setting, which would be resource. And a child way over here are still considered majority general education students. They are just requiring time outside of the general education classroom for resource time. And then you say you put in some additional pull-out time, related services that they get their speech language outside of the general education environment, occupational therapy outside of the, then once again, you would continue to move down. The more time that they spend out of the general education setting, the more restrictive their educational program becomes. And so that's why the calculations and the number of minutes that your child is receiving services become very important, because that is what sort of determines where they fall along this continuum. Okay. Now, if your child ends up being in a self-contained environment, then at that point, here they are. They're further away from this optimal. And if they're further away from this optimal, then you can see that the goal is always to move back. But some children, like my daughter, this is where they are, self-contained. That's not a problem, but that doesn't mean that even self-contained, that they can't jump over here for general education exposure to the general education curriculum, involvement in general education, events. Specials, specific classes, lunch, library, PE. There's always environments over here to where even self-contained children need to have this exposure, and the goal is to always move them over here. All right. Now, anything outside of next you would have homebound, and that would be children that require their special education and their related services be provided in the home environment. That doesn't necessarily mean the home environment. A child that is homebound can receive their services as drop-in services inside of the public education, or they can be provided at the public library or any other pre-apportioned or predetermined location. They don't have to be provided in the home. But then outside of that would be everywhere else. Let's say a day treatment program, a residential treatment program, a hospital. Those kind of things are even further out because they're further away from the optimal of no IEP in general education. Okay? So this is the least restrictive environment. This is the continuum of alternative placements. All right? Now, at the same time, if you were to draw another line down here, there is another aspect of least restrictive environment known as location. All right? So what the least restrictive environment, what the law says on that is that they're to educate your child in your home school. Okay? Now, if you can't within your home school, where can they do that? All right? This has to do with the IEP. Sometimes schools don't have the specific kind of programs at your home school to be able to service that IEP. And then that IEP would need to then do the analysis of location. What location would best serve that? And so if you said that this is already your child's, second move, why? Why? The consideration is always their zone school, their home school. But once again, everything revolves around how that IEP was developed, how it was written in order to know where the child fits on that continuum. Let's see, did I answer everything? I don't want to move him again as he's finally settled in and likes the school. And I think that's a very valid argument. But I hope that this sort of helps you navigate and sort of understand what you need to look at leading up to your meeting next week. Okay?